created by the cable television industry and offered to you as a public service by your local cable company. Next, History on Book TV. From the Carnegie Council in New York City, editors Michael Howard and William Roger Lewis discuss the Oxford history of the 20th century. The book is a collection of essays by leading scholars in modern history. It focuses on political, military, and diplomatic history.
Good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Merrill House Programs, and I'd like to welcome our members, guests, and C-SPAN to the Carnegie Council's Books for Breakfast. This morning we are very pleased to have as our guest speakers Sir Michael Howard and William Roger Lewis, who will be discussing a book they recently edited entitled The Oxford History of the 20th Century. The 20th century has been a whirlwind. It has witnessed the tripling of the Earth's population, 2 world wars, countless revolutions, and even the landing of a man on the moon. More than in any other period that preceded it, the events of the past 100 years have dramatically touched every continent and affected every human being on this planet. There is no doubt that this has been truly a global century of scientific discoveries, technological developments, economic progress, and cultural achievements that some have only dreamed about and others never imagined. As scholars seek to define this legacy and assess its significance for future generations, I would like to ask our guests this morning to share with us some of the contents that they have compiled for the Oxford History of the 20th Century and tell us how they think this time in history will be remembered. Few historians are able to illuminate our understanding of this era as Sir Michael and William Roger Lewis can. Sir Michael graduated from Oxford and was Professor of War Studies at King's College, London. From there, he went on to become a Fellow in Higher Defense Studies at All Souls College, Oxford, and later Professor of History at Oxford. Most recently, he was Professor of Military and Naval History at Yale. His works include the Franco-Prussian War, the Continental Commitment and War in European History. He also co-edited and translated Clausewitz on War. William Roger Lewis is Director of British Studies and Kerr Professor of English History and Culture at the University of Texas, Austin. And he is also a Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. As a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, he studied under A.J.P. Taylor. He is the Editor-in-Chief of the Oxford History of the British Empire. His books include Imperialism at Bay and the British Empire in the Middle East. In cooperation with Robert Blake, he edited Churchill. Won't you please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guests this morning, Sir Michael and William Roger Lewis.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the launch of what is a purely Anglo-American project, of which I represent simply the Anglo end and Roger the American end. But we were very conscious when we set about our task that this must be a history of the 20th century, not simply as seen from the North Atlantic. It should be neither Eurocentric nor Western-centric. Nonetheless, it was very difficult to handle without accepting that most of the events of the 20th century had their origin in particular, Europe and its problems as they had developed in the 19th. The first half of the book, therefore, is quite frankly Eurocentric, because from 1900 until the Second World War, Europe was still the focus of the world. What happened in Europe had repercussions throughout the world. When Europe sneezed, the whole of the world caught cold, and Europe sneezed very hard twice, once in 1914 and once in 1939. And the repercussions of those catastrophic fevers which it had caught spread throughout the world, and they have not worked their way out since. Now, another problem which one faced was that nothing began in the 20th century, and nothing will end in the 20th century. Centuries are purely arbitrary slices upon the flow of time which are imposed by, not so much by historians, but whoever it is who works out calendars and said that this is where you have got to begin and this is where you have got to end. And any of you who have had the misfortune of attending lectures on any period of history by any distinguished or even more undistinguished historians will know that if they are supposed to start with 1789, they don't. You're jolly lucky if after half a dozen lectures they have got as far as 1788 in order to be able to understand what actually did happen during the period they're supposed to be talking about. Now, nothing began in 1900 and nothing will end in the millennium. So the first thing one had to realize, what were the processes which were going on in 1900 which were to be so significant in what was going to happen over the next 100 years. And the major process was that which had been set off particularly and solely really in Northwest Europe and the United States, and in particular I'm proud to say in my own poor little country England, which was once a rich large country, and that was the beginning of industrialization and the beginning of modernization, which began in the middle of the 18th century, and the transformation of human life which that resulted in. The change from, as we put it in the book, from agrarian societies, when people lived on the whole in very small villages or towns which were fortunate if there were as many as 2,000 population, which drew their living almost entirely from the land, where the only sources of energy were manpower, woman power, horsepower, and wind power, when most people never moved more than 20 miles from their birthplace, where society was rigidly organized in a hierarchy based upon land ownership, to the kind of society which we see now, where society is entirely global, where people may live in villages, but they are, as Marshall McLuhan has put it, global villages, where we are all linked up by the instantaneous communications of the internet, where wealth is based not on land, but on industry and the derivations of industry, where politics and hierarchy is not based upon aristocracy and monarchy, but upon, at least allegedly, popular consent, where if religion survives, where and when religion survives, it is as a purely private matter, rather than as a mandatory doctrine to which determines public morality and is dictated by hierarchies of priests. Now, up till 1750, there was a certain monotony almost about history because none of that had changed for the best part of a millennium or even longer. In the beginning of the 18th century, suddenly, as the South African statesman Jan Christian Smuts put it, mankind broke camp and became on the march. And this process of change has been accelerating ever since. Now, if one was to write a history, if I were to write a history of the 19th century, it would be comparatively easy. One would be able to start with the Enlightenment in Europe, with the French Revolution in Europe, with the great political revolution in the United States. And one would then be able to show how, throughout the 19th century, that impacted upon European society, mainly purely European at that stage. The rest of the world changed very little, except the marginal impact made upon it by European colonization, which Roger Lewis deals with brilliantly in his book. By the beginning of the 20th century, Europe had been very largely already transformed by a process of disruption which had caused such political and economic turmoil that within 15 years, the whole continent collapsed into the first of what were going to be a series of devastating wars. We emerged from those in Europe thanks largely to the generosity and the strength of the United States, and have been trying to get our act together ever since. But during the rest of the 20th century, we have seen how all that turmoil, which was set up in Europe in the 19th century, spread to the rest of the world, with all the opportunities which industrialization and modernization has given to the world, with all the improvement in the standard of living, with a huge increase in population, which has very largely been the result of a reduction of the death rate because of the improvement of hygiene and of medicine, with the huge opportunities which are now open not simply to the wealthy in the West, but to all peoples throughout the world increasingly, for the improvement of their lifestyle and the transformation of their entire structure of their lives. This does not happen easily, it does not happen peacefully, it does not happen gently. The Enlightenment and everything that has gone with it has been like the eating of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. If there ever was an Eden, which of course there was not before the 18th century, we're not living in it now. We have been faced throughout this century with gigantic problems, and every solution of each of those problems has produced even greater ones. In Europe, we are now in a situation almost of, I won't quite say an exploded volcano, but certainly somewhere where the volcanic eruptions have settled down, and we are trying to put our act together on a rather more peaceful, rather more modest basis. We've got many problems of our own, but they no longer impact on the rest of the world. And I think one of the points which Roger and I have tried to make in our book is that since the Second World War, Europe has become no longer the epicenter of the world, it has become one of the regions of the world, and by no means the most important. So the second part of the book deals with the world on a very much more, as it were, balanced and equal-handed fashion. Now, which of those many regions which we deal with are going eventually to become really significant, really important, and really dangerous remains to be seen. The United States does remain, for better or worse, whether you like it or not, the major area which can determine how the history of the rest of the world goes. The extent to which it can do so is very much less than one might like, and very much less than many Americans once thought it would be. But nonetheless, not simply your wealth, but your energy, your inventiveness, and your, still, I'd like to say, self-confidence, though it's not as great as it once was, does still make you movers and shakers. But that gets us onto a very different kind of subject and gets us on to the 21st century. The 19th century, it was said, had been the British century. Well, it wasn't entirely, but we like to think so. The 20th century, it was said, was going to be the American century. Well, up to a point, up to a fashion, it has been, though not nearly as much as some of you would have wished. I don't think the 21st century is going to be anybody's century in particular. There are those who think it was going to be the Chinese century, but Roger, who's just back from there, will be able to say how likely that is going to be. All I can say is that dealing with the history of the 20th century has been a sufficient project for at least two historians, and I'm very happy to leave the history of the 21st century to another generation. Thank you.
Thank you. It's always a rather good thing to be able to follow Sir Michael Howard as the second speaker, because he speaks so eloquently and in such encompassing manner that it leaves me with little that I can add to what he can already said, and I also have less time to say it in. The question that Joanne asked us to address ourselves is, in fact, the question in the last sentence of the preface of the book. Has it, on the whole, been a good century, or will it be remembered as one of the most murderous in human history? Now, at the beginning of this project, we didn't really know how we were going to answer that question, and we didn't have any presuppositions about whether or not it was a good century or not. I think the general conclusion that all of us sort of generally reached by the end of the book, in a rather by way of consensus, that we have managed to survive 2 world wars, and beyond that we have managed to survive the Cold War. So that does give us grounds for hope, at least for the problems that may be confronting us in the next century, which are bound to be as difficult and as painful as the problems that confronted those at the beginning of the century. What I would like to do, just to give you an idea of how the historians who are participating in this project went about their job, is to give you a brief kind of history of the history, because I think it's always interesting in this sort of occasion to learn a little bit about the authors and the way in which they went about their organizational projects. This is the Oxford history of the 20th century. Sir Michael Howard is an Oxford historian. I divide my time between the University of Texas and Oxford. We were aware that the Oxford history should have a solid core of Oxford authors, and indeed it does. Archie Brown on the Soviet Union, Lord Derendorf as the distinguished scholar who kind of wraps up the book and looks towards the 20th century. But we also wanted to prove to the world that this was not going to be merely an Oxford history, that we wanted to select for the various chapters absolutely the best historians that we could find for the job. And so we reached out, believe it or not, to the United States as well as Oxford. And we have Jonathan Spence on China, Akira Irie of Harvard on East Asia, Richard Stites of Georgetown on the Russian period before the Soviet Revolution, and we have my colleague at the University of Texas, Stephen Weinberg, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist, who tells us in one of the earlier chapters how to make sense of science in the 20th century. Michael mentioned that I have just returned from China as 2 days ago, and this rather brought home to me the basic theme of the book, because individually the chapters are actually in conflict with each other in the sense that there is a debate among historians about the meaning of industrialization, the meaning of various questions, which the answers of which vary from perspective to perspective. And we didn't know at the beginning how this was going to work out. What we did know was that we wanted to get the best historians that we could to look at the regional problems as well as the general trends of the 20th century from the vantage points of China and Latin America and the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and so on. So this was the very dramatic sort of recent self-revelation that I had in visiting China, that the history of the 20th century simply does look quite different if you are looking at it from a Chinese point of view rather than from a Western point of view. So that emerged as kind of one of the grand themes of the book. Insofar as it has a overall theme, it is the shift in perspective. It is the shift in perspective from Europe to Asia, to India, to the Middle East, to Africa, and around other parts of the world. Now, when this book began, if I may reveal a secret of the Oxford University Press, the book began its life as the Oxford Illustrated History of the 20th century. And at one point we were told by the director of the Oxford University Press in Oxford that we were going to be upgraded. He didn't use that word because that's American airline language, but he used some similar phrase to let us know that we were being elevated in status, that it was no longer going to be an Oxford history of the illustrated history of the 20th century, because the Oxford Press was afraid that it would then be merely regarded as another coffee table book. The line that they gave us was that we had assembled such a team of distinguished historians that they wanted to call it now the Oxford History of the 20th century, but without relinquishing all of the beautiful plates and photographs in the book. And so actually you are getting the book best of both worlds. You're getting the Oxford Illustrated History, but at the same time you're getting the Oxford History of the 20th century. And I think the significance of all of this is that you have a team of historians that are the very best that the two of us in Oxford and reaching out towards other places around the world could put together for a comprehensive story of the world in the 20th century as it does shift in perspective from China to other parts of the world. And I would like for you to bear in mind that this was deliberately intended to be a readable book so that you can pick it up and actually enjoy it as well as feel that you're learning something from it. Some of you, I think, will actually have a copy of the book because it's been picked up by the Oxford, by the History Book Club, and so you see it advertised every week in the New York Times and so on as one of the selections that you can get. So as I say, no doubt if some of you already have it, and so I would leave you with the thought that here is an opportunity to pick up a great Christmas present that you can send to other people in the family. Thanks very much.
Sir Michael and Mr. Lewis have agreed to take questions, so I ask that you identify yourself and keep your question brief and to the point. Sir Michael.
Yes, ma'am.
My name is Sherry Mueller. I'm with the National Council for International Visitors, and I wanted to ask you how you think historians will characterize our era. We, in the U.S. at least, often refer to it as the post-Cold War era, which is what it is not. And what do you think historians will, what designation will they perhaps have for this period? Or do they already?
When historians are in doubt, they always say an age of transition. I think we will stick with that one for a bit. Yes, sir.
You mentioned the debate.
I'm sorry, Roger, do you want to come in on
No,
that?
I was told that I should stand along with you.
Okay, then you keep quiet.
I'm William Vokey with the World Affairs Councils of America. You mentioned in the book a debate among the historians which is perhaps unresolved about the industrial character and the impact of industrialization. And could you characterize the different positions in that debate?
Well, let me have a stab at that, because if you look at the theme of modernization, for example, it does appear quite differently if you're looking at it from a European point of view. Two of the authors who wrote the chapters on the one on Africa, Terry Ranger, and the other on the Middle East, Roger Owen, who is the professor of Middle Eastern Affairs at Harvard, take into dispute the whole concept of modernization, that if you look at it from an African point of view, modernization is something that is alien to African way of looking at things. It takes on a whole different meaning. Roger Owen in the Middle East, for example, would say that modernization was well underway before the, in Middle Eastern terms, before the Industrial Revolution in the West, and that the Arabs and other peoples of the Middle East have their own idea about about modernization. So you get this kind of internal debate among the historians in the volume about the meanings of these very basic concepts.
Yes, if I could just add to that. I learned a great deal in doing this because I originally suggested as an overall theme it should be that of modernization and globalization, of the kind which I have outlined already, thinking this was a fairly non-contentious matter. That it has happened. I don't say it was a good thing or it was a bad thing, but it has happened, is continuing to happen, and can't be stopped. But then a number of my most distinguished colleagues said these are fighting words. No, modernization suggests improvement. We can't use that word. They said, well, what do we use? And then that was great fun. They then argued about it for hours. And we eventually agreed that each was going to treat the matter as they best wished. Mr.
Warren Zimmerman, Columbia University. I have a question for Professor Howard on World War I. A lot of people, myself included, blame World War I for most of the horrors of the century because it brought us indirectly both Stalin and Hitler. Can I ask you to indulge in a little bit of counter-history? Imagine that diplomacy in 1914 had prevented World War I, or that if it started, it had been settled with a no-fault armistice in late 1914 or early 1915. What sort of a century would we then have had?
The trouble with counterfactuals is that one can't just change one event. If you change one event, innumerable other events get changed as well. And when one isn't looking at, because A didn't happen, would B have happened? If A hadn't happened, what enormous range of possibilities might then have happened otherwise? I think that all historians can do is say, why did A actually happen? Why was it that the First World War did occur and had caused the damage which it did? And I'm glad to say that historians are still arguing about that one, the degree to which Germany was responsible for the First World War. I myself believe that the tensions which were endemic in Europe at the beginning of the century were going to cause, anyhow, some major kind of upheaval. Whether that, in the first place, as you would know better than most, the situation in Southeast Europe was highly volatile. The possibilities of conflict there were immense, and the likelihood of the powers of Europe being able to get together as they had in 1878 and impose another peace which was lasting were pretty remote. You do have a Germany which is in extremely febrile and hysterical condition under a very, very odd elite of what one can now call proto-fascists. And the likelihood of Germany causing trouble of a major kind, very, very great. You have a Britain which is powerful, but at the same time immensely apprehensive, frightened of being overtaken by Germany and the United States, on the defensive, almost in many respects looking for a chance to prove that it is still a great power. Put all those and many other things together. Very hard to imagine that you're going to have a peaceful settlement in which all is going to be settled by men of goodwill.
I'd like to add a note to a hypothetical question that I was recently asked in China, and that I was talking about the relative period of reconciliation between the British and the Chinese in the 1920s, which was interrupted by the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. Well, what would have happened if the Japanese had not invaded Manchuria? And the answer from the Chinese side was that Shanghai might have developed into the equivalent of what we know today as Hong Kong. And there is another interesting hypothetical on Hong Kong itself, because what would have happened if the British had pursued their original course in the post-1945 period to encourage a Hong Kong identity and to encourage Hong Kong along the road of becoming an independent city-state on the model of Singapore. Hong Kong would probably not exist today because the Chinese would have taken violent exception to the policy of encouraging Hong Kong independence. So hypothetical questions can sometimes be very interesting, I think.
Oh, you're doing?
No.
Oh, well.
ABC television. For Professor Lewis, why won't the 21st century be the Chinese century?
Well, I'm not entirely persuaded that it won't be the 20th century. I was very much struck in China with the pace and the degree of modernization. I was also quite struck with the openness in the university community, especially among the students, with the lack of an ideological tone to the discussion. Quite open, quite friendly. You had to kind of pinch yourself to believe that you were not in a communist country. The people in China, so far as I could meet out, are, how should I put it, as self-centered and as so concerned with their own problems as the Americans are with those. I'd say that China and the United States are probably the two most self-centered countries in the world. And in putting bets on modernization, I myself would put it on China rather than India. This is a personal impression, but I would.
Larry Bridwell, Pace University. A question for you, Sir Michael Howard. We were talking about the impact of regionalism, particularly the developments in Scotland. Could you comment on the future of the 21st century of Europe? Is it going to evolve into 50 regions? And particularly, again, in the case of Scotland, what is your forecast?
Here again, one could say there are an almost infinite number of options which do lie before us. I think that a general view, and we have Edward Mortimer here, who's a most distinguished English journalist who's been following this a great deal more closely than I have. But a sort of a general view, I think, in my country and in Europe, is that the existing nation states as they are, with their focus upon London and upon Paris and on Bonn, Berlin, are gradually going to dissolve, and that more power will go upwards towards Brussels, more power will go downwards to quasi-autonomous regions which may or may not develop into separate nation states. I myself think that unlikely to develop into nation states as we have known them in the past. I think that an autonomous Scotland is certainly going to emerge, and I'm surprised it's never emerged earlier, because they are such a distinctive and proud and talented people. The same is likely to happen, of course, in Germany, where already you have the Länder with a great deal of their own independent power. In Italy, you already have at least two separate almost autonomous states. All that, I think, is going to continue to be the case. What is going to happen to the United Kingdom is very difficult to say. What is going to be left for people like me, Englishmen, after the Scots have gone and the Welsh have gone and the Irish have already gone? All I can say is that if an independent Scotland were actually to emerge with its own army, navy, air force and professional bodies, there'd be very, very little left of England. Anything you?
Well, no, I do want to add that the Oxford University Press is also the publisher of a large work called the Oxford History of the British Empire. And we find this rather ironic that with the dissolution of the empire, the United Kingdom has now moved into a state of not unraveling, but a very interesting historical stage. But I'm not necessarily pessimistic that that it's going to break into its separate components. I think that the Scots and the Irish within the larger framework of Europe can still maintain a British identity.
Right. You, sir.
I'm Dagan, I'm Swedish Consul General, so I'd like to make an observation on this country and what you just said about China. You said that China and the United States are possibly the most self-centered cultures today. But that also goes for confidence, self-confidence. Isn't self-confidence the key to the movements in a society? You can say that Germany in 1914 was a proto-fascist country, but there was enormous self-confidence. If you look at the Asian crisis today, you have a loss of self-confidence. Can you elaborate a bit on the role of self-confidence today and the lack of it in Europe?
I thought that was addressed to you. Well, let me say, yes, the one thing one could characterize all Europeans by now is lack of self-confidence, especially with the disappearance of Chancellor Kohl and Margaret Thatcher from the scene. I'm not sure there's not quite a lot of self-confidence left around in Paris, but that's a rather different matter. One of the things which kept me personally, and I think my generation, afloat during the years of the Cold War, was the self-confidence of the United States. And one of the sad things which I have been conscious of has been the erosion of that self-confidence ever since Vietnam. That perhaps it's a matter of the United States having been cut down to size, and the size is about correct now. But it was marvelous when they felt that in the United States people felt they could do anything, go anywhere, solve any problems, etc., etc. Do the Chinese have the self-confidence that they can manage the affairs of the world? Do they wish to manage the affairs of the world?
I don't know about the Chinese, but I would like to say a word about the Americans, because I agree that we as a nation are not as self-confident as we were before the Vietnam War, but I think that we now have moved into a different phase of our history. I was quite struck, as a matter of fact, when my wife and I went to see the movie Saving Private Ryan, because I think this was an indication that we have put Vietnam behind us, that we can now see the reality of American troops being killed in combat. We can still take pride in the Second World War. I think this goes along with the recognition, perhaps, that we can't solve all of the problems in the world. We can merely do our best to try to take on the problems that are manageable, and I'm not persuaded that that's not a good thing, to have scaled down our global ambitions of a generation ago.
Yes, sir.
A question, please don't be offended. How, looking at an edited book, which I've had some experience with, how did you manage, let's say, to meld in the various philosophies of experts in the field in various regions? Did you set up certain guidelines? How far did your quote-unquote overview or censorship dictate in putting this together, a text, a volume such as this? What was the problems internally? How did you manage the various personalities, if you will? I know myself, I was writing something for a book or something, so my own partisanship is interjected. I would be interested in how you handle these various situations.
Well,
you start, because I bang on far too long.
No, I merely say that this is a book which is composed of prima donnas who are, they're not to be controlled. What we did was try to get the very best people that we could get to work in various fields. And we had a meeting in Oxford and saw at once that everyone was going to disagree about everything, so that the only thing that we could do was kind of to agree that we would move forward on a chronological basis, with each author making the individual judgment of what problems were important or significant in his field, and we would hope for the best. So in a curious part of way, it all came together simply on the basis of the ability of the historians participating in the contrast. Now, that doesn't sound like a very organized way of going about it, but that is the sort of Oxford way of producing a book.
I can't add to that. It's very good. Yes, ma'am.
Des Moines, Iowa. You know, history is always supposed to teach us something. Looking back now, after the book has been completed, in spite of all the disagreements and the various philosophies, in your view, would you care to comment at all on some things that you may be seeing as lessons to be learned?
About how to produce a book of history?
No, I'm going to give you the harder one. Lessons to be learned from our experiences in this century, as you look back now.
I've written a large book called The Lessons of History, which says that there are no lessons to be learned from history. That history as such doesn't teach lessons. Historians sometimes think they can teach lessons. How can one really derive from that guidelines to the future? One can see where catastrophes happened. Occasionally one can attribute the mistakes made to individual statesmen or individual countries, and if only they had done something different, it wouldn't have happened like that. I mean, the one experience which I think has very generally been learned from the 1930s is that you should try to nip aggression in the bud as early as you possibly can. And I am one of those who believe that if Britain and France had stood up to Hitler in 1936 when he invaded the Rhineland, then a great deal of history would be different. But that lesson has been learned, allegedly, by many other people. Anthony Eden in 1956, confronted with Nasser's seizure of the Suez Canal, said, "Here we go again. We must at once prevent aggression before it develops further and Nasser becomes unstoppable." The result was the Suez Crisis, and one of the most catastrophic errors ever made by any English statesman. So do be very, very careful about learning lessons from what you think is history. Yes, sir.
I wonder if the communications revolution came too late in the century for you to have described some sort of role as to its impact. The whole explosion of communications technology. What's been the impact of the chip?
I would simply say that I think you're right. It's far too early to judge. The explosion has occurred within the last decade. It's still going on. It's far too soon to see what its implications are and what its results are likely to be. So I bow out from that one. Are you going to be bolder?
No, I would rather hear your answer to
My answer? You're the historians. Could you give us at least your vague impressions as to what's going to be the outcome of this in either a positive or a negative or way?
No, I'm sorry. Historians describe the past. I'm a historian. When historians start looking into the future, they change their whole nature. They become futurologists. They need a different kind of training, which I haven't got. Never had. I'm too old, quite frankly, for that sort of thing.
I'm sorry. Can I ask, what appears to be missing in your overview of your book is what has happened to the ecology of the world over the 20th century, that the disappearance of a significant proportion of the rainforest, of animals becoming extinct, of the use of disappearance of fossil fuel, to give many. And for me, discussing 2 nights ago at the National History Museum, the most significant book for me is Silent Spring by Rachel Carson.
Yes.
Do you deal in your book with that aspect of the history of the 20th century, which seems to me one of the most important?
We have a chapter which deals not exclusively, but with that, by Bill McNeill. Particularly on demography and the environment, and the impact particularly of the huge increase of the global population on the world as a whole. But
well, these were questions that we did include in a sort of organizational scheme, and we asked each of the people dealing, for example, in specific chapters on the regions, in India, Middle East, Africa, Latin America, to take into account certain broad themes such as environment, so that it's supposed to be interwoven into the fabric of the book itself.
But there is this specific chapter on it, and then in his wrap-up at the end, Ralph Dahrendorf does deal with it again and points it up as one of the major problems for the next century.
And I wanted to point, Ralph Dahrendorf does deal with the technological issues going into the next century.
Yes. Bill.
you made a disclaimer that you weren't a Bill Frederick, I'm an attorney in private practice here in New York. You made a disclaimer that you aren't a futurologist, but in reviewing one of your essays from 1962, I believe, on peace and disarmament, I noted that you said that in a world in which you had peace and disarmament in Europe or between the great powers wouldn't necessarily be a more secure world. And one of the examples you illustrated with was that Iraq and Kuwait were unlikely to stop their disputes simply because the great powers resolved their own. I think that was a pretty prescient comment to be made in 1962. But my question is, we've been grappling to try to find mechanisms for collective security going into the 21st century. There's been the United Nations, there's been NATO, there's of course been the independent role of the U.S. and its allies. How do both of you perceive the 21st century in terms of where we in the United States and in Europe should be looking to build or rebuild collective security institutions? Should we be looking to NATO and the UN, or do you have diminished faith in such multilateral structures to nip aggression in the bud, as you were referring to earlier?
Well, in the first place, there is an excellent chapter in the book by Adam Roberts on international organizations, you know, the United Nations in particular, which I think is actually one of the more luscious currents in the bun. My own feeling about the development of the global community is that it is coming about and will continue to come about not as a result of cooperation of states, quite often in spite of the cooperation of states, but through the development of a global community at sub-state level, the development of non-state actors, the growth of non-governmental organizations. And this, I think, is one way in which the information revolution is having its major results. The fact that peoples at every level are communicating with one another, that specialists in various groups get together with one another. It's been happening for a very long time, ever since, really, the 19th century in Europe. It's now becoming global. But the amount that states as such and governments can do to that, I think, can be often overestimated. The best thing they can usually do is to provide a structure within which the global community can get on with its job, break down the barriers towards global communication of various kinds. And I think would like to see a considerable degree of modesty about what can actually be done by governments other than being enablers of peoples to function as they would wish. Yes, ma'am.
Sarah Everett from the British Information Services Office. Professor Howard, you said that how Europe had organized itself after the end of the Second World War and now was really having very little impact on the rest of the world. So would you say, therefore, that the whole of the development of the European Union and what some Europeans would view as a fairly seismic happening coming, the introduction of a single European currency, are going to have very little impact on the rest of the world?
Well, I believe that when it actually happens, of course. That's another different. But one does then get into the question of international economy, where I must admit that I'm complete ignoramus. And the development, if Europe, first of all, comes into existence and does become a true entity, and not simply an economic unit, but something with a common financial policy, a common foreign policy, an entity like the United States, then we are seeing something very interesting and very unusual happening. But the obstacles to that occurring do still seem to me to be enormous. The disappearance of Chancellor Kohl has brought a German government into power, which quite clearly does not have the really faintest idea what it can do. The structure which was put together by Kohl and Mitterrand, in spite of everything which Mrs. Thatcher could do, was a very strong and important one. I think that the structure created by not simply the Brussels bureaucrats, but by senior officials in every country, in my own country, one's very conscious that the Department of Trade, the Treasury, and the Foreign Office do have an agenda of their own, which is much closer to that of their colleagues on the continent than it is to many politicians in their own countries. And that is creating a great, as it were, functional unit within Europe, but it isn't a political unit yet. And I think that the obstacles, the withdrawing tides of political support in each of those major countries is going to mean it'll be a very long time before you can talk of Europe or Europa as anything more than a geographical or possibly an economic expression.
I'd just like to put an American twist on this because I come from Texas, and we are still very much aware of the way in which the free trade area with Mexico is working out. I share an office with a Mexican historian who goes back and forth, and the impression that I get from talking to various people is that the trade area may have benefited substantially the United States, but it most definitely is not benefiting the common people of Mexico, but has had the paradoxical effect of creating a sort of mafia, especially in Mexico City, that are benefiting from the new financial arrangements, but not really the way in which people hoped that this would be turning out. So I think we're kind of at a very interesting juncture of seeing how these world trends are working out, not merely in Europe, but throughout the world.
I'd like to say also that if I were one of you, I would ask a question, what about Russia? 100 years ago, or rather more than that, Alexis de Tocqueville said the future is in the hands of these two great powers, the United States and Russia, and they will, the destiny of the world is divided between them. Well, what's happened? Russia has exploded or imploded or whatever. It seems to be no longer there any longer. It's an enormous basket case. What is the implication of that going to be for the rest of the world? Well, I leave that again to somebody else to deal with. Yes, again?
I'd like to come back to the two trends that you were, William Vokey with the World Affairs Councils, that you were mentioning and ask you if you see the possibility of conflict in these two trends. And one trend is globalization, which you've talked about, which is driven by technology and economics. But the other trend you mentioned in regard to Scotland and others is this search for identity and the resurgence of virulent nationalism. We see it again in the Balkans, but you could also imagine it in Lombardy or Brittany or in Texas. And the kind of the need for people to have a identifiable home, which is in contrast to that globalization trend. Do you see a possibility for that being a source of major conflict in the 21st century?
This is a point which is very well made by Ralph Dahrendorf in his final summing up, what he calls the return to the tribe. And this is something which, again, has been going on for the past couple of hundred years. The process of the Enlightenment, which is a globalization process, the assumption that all men and women are very much the same, think all much the same, they're all rational, and that therefore something which can be worked out by experts in one country are going to be of universal value to everybody else. Then the violent reaction to that, which was started coming in Europe from the Germans. I mean, so the German nationalism comes up as a reaction against French universalism. And then the growth of nationalism as a whole in Europe, as a reaction against the globalization of the Enlightenment. The dislike of what was seen as a sort of Anglo-Franco-American rationalism, which stirred up the pan-Slavism in Russia, which stirs up the sort of German and feelings and everywhere else, the development of the sense that we are our own people, our own blood and our own soil, and that, a European phenomenon of the 19th and early 20th century, now is becoming global. And we're going to see, I think, an increasing amount of that dialectic working itself out in political, one fears occasionally military conflict as well.
I'd like to just answer that question also very briefly by introducing the element of the change in generations, which I think is very important. For example, in Ireland, I think that Ireland, the Republic, being able to be part of Europe enables people, especially of the younger generation, which there's a buoyancy and an optimism to say that we are at once Irish. We can even, perhaps some of us in Northern Ireland, call ourselves British as well as Irish. We're also Europeans. I was also struck in this visit to China that in Shanghai, on the newsstands, you buy the International Herald Tribune. In the hotel rooms, you can turn on the television and you get CNN. Now, I don't know where this is taking us, but it's certainly there.
And I think, if I can just sort of come back on that one, the Irish are able to do that because we have allowed them to become Irish. There's no longer in any attempt to suppress the Irish nationality. It has taken them the best part of 3 generations to acquire that degree of self-confidence and relaxed capacity to cooperate, no longer chips on the shoulder any longer. And that has got to be the way in which it goes with the development of all these other sense of sort of tribal identity.
We have time for one last question, John.
Lawrence Clark, Water. Thank you very much, sir. When I was a young boy in the 30s, my father gave me a book called The History of the World by Hendrik von Loon. It was about 700 pages, and it was illustrated, and I read it in 2 days, and it was magnificent. Now, my comment is Hendrik von Loon was a towering intellect, and he knew everything about everything, and he wrote this book with one view. How would you compare your book with his book?
I also was given by my father the story of mankind about my 14th birthday, and I was vastly impressed. I haven't looked at it since. I suspect that, great a book as it was, if I were to read it now, I would not be so impressed. Now, it is... I would far rather, quite frankly, have that either Roger or I had written our own history of the 20th century and being able to impose our own vision upon the whole thing. It would be made a much more readable book, if I may say so, but a very much less useful one. But the individuals have their own vision. It may be an interesting one. It may be an inspiring one, but it is one person's vision. And after that one person has disappeared, it becomes simply a part of the sort of the rubble of historiography. I hope that our book, being not simply one person's vision, but 24 experts' visions, will have a rather longer shelf life.
I thank you both for providing us with such a lively foundation for our discussion this morning. And for a long shelf life, I suggest that you buy our book, which will be on the upper platform for sale. Thank you. I had the seat there. I had to give it away. Good to see you. Actually, let me introduce you to him because Sir Michael.
I'll do it here.
Sir Michael Howard lives in England and was a professor at Oxford University. William Roger Lewis is a professor of English history and culture at the University of Texas at Austin. For more information about their book, write the Oxford University Press at 198 Madison Avenue, New York, New York, 10016. Their website is
of the 20th century, not simply as seen from the North Atlantic. It should be neither Eurocentric nor Western-centric. Nonetheless, it was very difficult to handle without accepting that most of the events of the 20th century had their origin in particular, Europe and its problems as they had developed in the 19th. The first half of the book, therefore, is quite frankly Eurocentric, because from 1900 until the Second World War, Europe was still the focus of the world. What happened in Europe had repercussions throughout the world. When Europe sneezed, the whole of the world caught cold, and Europe sneezed very hard twice, once in 1914 and once in 1939. And the repercussions of those catastrophic fevers which it caught spread throughout the world, and they have not worked their way out since. Now, another problem which one faced was that nothing began in the 20th century, and nothing will end in the 20th century. Centuries are purely arbitrary slices upon the flow of time, which are imposed by, not so much by historians, but whoever it is who works out calendars, and said that this is where you have got to begin and this is where you have got to end. And any of you who have had the misfortune of attending lectures on any period of history by any distinguished or even more undistinguished historians will know that if they are supposed to start with 1789, they don't. You're jolly lucky if after half a dozen lectures they have got as far as 1788 in order to be able to understand what actually did happen during the period they're supposed to be talking about.
Created by the cable television industry and offered to you as a public service by your local cable company. Next, history on Book TV. From the Carnegie Council in New York City, editors Michael Howard and William Roger Lewis discuss the Oxford history of the 20th century. The book is a collection of essays by leading scholars in modern history. It focuses on political, military, and diplomatic history.
Good morning. I'm Joanne Myers, Director of Merrill House Programs, and I'd like to welcome our members, guests, and C-SPAN to the Carnegie Council's Books for Breakfast. This morning we are very pleased to have as our guest speakers Sir Michael Howard and William Roger Lewis, who will be discussing a book they recently edited entitled The Oxford History of the 20th Century. The 20th century has been a whirlwind. It has witnessed the tripling of the Earth's population, 2 world wars, countless revolutions, and even the landing of a man on the moon. More than in any other period that preceded it, the events of the past 100 years have dramatically touched every continent and affected every human being on this planet. There is no doubt that this has been truly a global century of scientific discoveries.
When religion survives, it is as a purely private matter, rather than as a mandatory doctrine to which determines public morality and is dictated by hierarchies of priests. Now, up till 1750, there was a certain monotony almost about history, because none of that had changed for the best part of a millennium or even longer. In the beginning of the 18th century, suddenly, as the South African statesman, young Christian Smuts put it, mankind broke camp and became on the march. And this process of change has been accelerating ever since. Now, if one was to write a history, if I were to write a history of the 19th century, it would be comparatively easy. One would be able to start with the Enlightenment in Europe, with the French Revolution in Europe, with the great political revolution in the United States. And one would then be able to show how, throughout the 19th century, that impacted upon European society, mainly purely European at that stage. The rest of the world changed very little, except the marginal impact made upon it by European colonization, which Roger Lewis deals with brilliantly in his book. By the beginning of the 20th century, Europe had been very largely already transformed by a process of disruption, which had caused such political and economic turmoil that within 15 years, the whole continent collapsed into the first of what were going to be a series of devastating wars. We emerged from those in Europe thanks largely to the generosity and the strength of the United States, and have been trying to get our act together ever since. Now, nothing began in 1900 and nothing will end in the millennium. So the first thing one had to realize, what were the processes which were going on in 1900 which were to be so significant in what was going to happen over the next 100 years? And the major process was that which had been set off particularly and solely really in Northwest Europe and the United States. And in particular, I'm proud to say, in my own poor little country, England, which was once a rich, large country, and that was the beginning of industrialization and the beginning of modernization, which began in the middle of the 18th century, and the transformation of human life, which that resulted in. The change from, as we put it in the book, from agrarian societies, when people lived on the whole in very small villages or towns, which were fortunate if they were as many as 2,000 population, which drew their living almost entirely from the land, where the only sources of energy were manpower, womanpower, horsepower, and wind power, when most people never moved more than 20 miles from their birthplace, where society was rigidly organized in a hierarchy based upon land ownership, to the kind of society which we see now, where society is entirely global, where people may live in villages, but they are, as Marshall McLuhan has put it, global villages, where we are all linked up by the instantaneous communications of the internet, where wealth is based not on land, but on industry and the derivations of industry, where politics and hierarchy is not based upon aristocracy and monarchy, but upon, at least allegedly, popular consent, where if religion survived, where and
technological developments, economic progress, and cultural achievements that some have only dreamed about and others never imagined. As scholars seek to define this legacy and assess its significance for future generations, I would like to ask our guests this morning to share with us some of the contents that they have compiled for the Oxford History of the 20th Century, and tell us how they think this time in history will be remembered. Few historians are able to illuminate our understanding of this era as Sir Michael and William Roger Lewis can. Sir Michael graduated from Oxford and was Professor of War Studies at King's College, London. From there, he went on to become a Fellow in Higher Defense Studies at All Souls College, Oxford, and later Professor of History at Oxford. Most recently, he was Professor of Military and Naval History at Yale. His works include the Franco-Prussian War, the Continental Commitment and War in European History. He also co-edited and translated Clausewitz on War. William Roger Lewis is Director of British Studies and Kerr Professor of English History and Culture at the University of Texas, Austin. And he is also a Fellow at St. Anthony's College, Oxford. As a Marshall Scholar at Oxford, he studied under A.J.P. Taylor. He is the Editor-in-Chief of the Oxford History of the British Empire. His books include Imperialism at Bay and the British Empire in the Middle East. In cooperation with Robert Blake, he edited Churchill. Won't you please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our guests this morning, Sir Michael and William Roger Lewis.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for coming to the launch of what is a purely Anglo-American project, of which I represent simply the Anglo end and Roger the American end. But we were very conscious when we set about our task that this must be a history